Well, hello. My name's Adrienne Gilbert, and if you haven't heard of me before, I'm an author of quite a number of books, mainly within the fields of alternative history, forgotten archaeology, uh, ancient mysteries, and prophecy. I've written books, for instance, such as Stone of Destiny, Mysteries of the Stone of Destiny, which concerns the coronation stone on which the monarchs of Great Britain have been crowned for 1,000 years and more. There's a lot of secrets about that stone, how it got to be in the British Isles, the shape of it, and what that symbolizes, and how that connects with the pyramids in Egypt. Uh, Surprising amount when you start digging into these subjects. The Blood of Avalon, which explores the whole Arthurian dynasty in Wales, which is the obvious place where it was really located, not the southwest of England, as many people think. And the continuation of that dynasty to this day within certain families within Britain. A must read. The End of Time, which is looking at the Mayan calendar. I've written two books on the Mayan subject. The first was called The Mayan Prophecies, which was a major bestseller back in 1995. And then I wrote this one in time for 2012, which went much more deeply into that whole subject about the Maya, the Aztecs, what they really believed. Magi, another best-selling book, follows the story of the three kings. Where did they come from? What is this really all about? Why was this story put into the New Testament, right at the start of the New Testament even, when these guys were pagans? There's a lot of mysteries there connecting with what later became Christianity and the connections with a whole star religion, which was understood at the time of Egypt and in Mesopotamia. Continuing that theme, Signs in the Sky investigates certain prophecies contained in the Bible, particularly in the Matthew Gospel in chapter 24 and in the book of Revelation, and relates those to the movements, particularly of the constellation of Orion, and the connection with certain positions. For instance, there's a position called the Stargate, where the ecliptic crosses the Milky Way. Very important, was well understood in antiquity, but is forgotten about now, and how that gives us the time scales for what is prophesied in the Bible. And probably the most famous book that I'm connected with, I was the co-author of this book, The Orion Mystery, which I wrote with Robert Bauval, was a major bestseller in 1994, exploring the whole subject of the pyramids and how the pyramids of Orion, pyramids of Giza, were meant to represent the stars of Orion's belt. So I hope you see from this that I do have a pedigree of investigations into all sorts of ancient mysteries, and I've continued with that theme right throughout my life. And now I'm busy setting up something I'm calling the Invisible College. Actually, I already set up the Invisible College some years back, but I discontinued it for various reasons, mainly to do with health. But I'm restarting it now with a friend of mine, Leonardo Lavari from Italy, and we're going to try to make this a major resource on the internet for people who want to explore these ideas, who want to share their own discoveries, and to receive further videos and lectures, long lectures on these different subjects. So where did I get this idea from? Well, it's not an entirely new one. Back in the 15th century, in Italy, they established something called the Florentine Academy. Now, you've all heard of Florence, I'm sure, one of the most beautiful cities in Italy, with its Duomo and the Palace of the Medicis, the famous bridge over the Arno. Well, the Florentine Academy was set up by a guy called Cosimo de' Medici, who was the great Duke of Florence in the sort of middle period of the 15th century, the 16th century, 15th century. Get that right, Adrian. 15th century. And he was very concerned with the same kind of things I am, trying to find out what knowledge has been lost from the past and what knowledge we can gain in the present that is going to help to transform our civilization into the future. And he engaged this other man, Marsilio Ficino, who was a great philosopher and also a linguist who knew Greek and Latin, to take the ancient texts, which were then starting to come to light out of old libraries, and translate them so that Cosimo and his circle could read them in either Latin or Italian. So they founded the Florentine Academy with Marsilio Ficino as the kind of the guy who ran it. You could call him the headmaster, I suppose, under the patronage of Cosimo de' Medici. And this had a huge impact on European civilization, because around that time, in 1453, the great city of Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, fell to the Turks, and a lot of books were brought, well, not a lot, but some books were brought out from there by the people who were fleeing from this. And among those books was one called Hermetica, which contained the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, which hadn't been seen in the West since the fall of the Roman Empire. So Cosimo was very excited when this book came into his hands, but it was written in Greek and he didn't know Greek. So he got Marsilio Ficino to put aside the works of Plato and to get on with translating this. And the reason this was important was that they believed that this Hermes was the same personage as we know in the Bible by the name of Enoch. And Enoch, if you've read your Old Testament, was the great-grandfather of Noah, which he was the 7th generation from Adam, which made him antediluvian, from before the flood. So they were hoping that they were going to find a lot of information in this book that hadn't been known since the time of Noah's flood. Well, of course, modern scholarship has sort of debunked that kind of dating. We now know it was written much more recently than that, probably around the time of Jesus. But even so, it's hugely interesting in the light it throws on the mysteries of ancient Egypt and what the ancient Egyptians believed. You could call this the last breath of the old pagan Egypt before it became Christianized and later Islamized. And it contained a lot of teachings to do with stars, to do with out-of-body experiences, astrology, things like this, which were outlawed, really, by the church of their day. And this kind of gave an input, an impetus to the nascent Renaissance that was happening in Florence at the same time, with people like Leonardo with all their painting, and Michelangelo, and many other scholars and philosophers and artists operating at that time. So this was, this is what happens when you have an academy of this sort that brings ideas together with people of creativity. It can bring about a rebirth. But that's not the only time that this kind of idea has been appealing to people. In the early 17th century, certain pamphlets appeared, first of all in Germany and then later translated into other languages, about a new brotherhood that was forming called the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross. Now, that's nothing to do with the people who advertise in magazines today, calling themselves Rosicrucians and inviting you to take on a mail order subscription. Nothing to do with that. This was about the whole idea of an instauration or restoration, we might better call it today, of science. That science had ceased to happen, really, since the time of Aristotle. Aristotle, if you've read his books, was very much into defining knowledge and scientific knowledge as it stood in his time, which is about just before, well, around the same time as Alexander the Great. He was Alexander the Great's teacher. But nothing had been allowed to develop since then. If it wasn't in Aristotle, people didn't want to know. So there was this movement in the early 17th century that we should be trying to understand the book of nature, that there are two books. The one book is the Bible, of course, which everybody subscribed to at that time as being the Word of God. But there was this other book, the book of nature, which we also needed to study to understand God's laws. So the whole idea of scientists, they didn't call them scientists then, they called them natural philosophers. The whole idea of natural philosophy was that you studied the two books in tandem, and out of this you would find a new meaning to life, a new possibility. Again, this idea of the rebirth of a new civilization. Well, that didn't really get very far at that time, but it did sow certain seeds, particularly in England. And in the 1640s, during the time of the Commonwealth period, the time of Cromwell, a new college formed called the Invisible College, which brought together a number of professors, and they met together first of all at this place, Gresham College in London. Now that had a special role to play in this. A man called Sir Thomas Gresham, time of Queen Elizabeth, he'd been founder of the Royal Exchange and had really built up the economy of England at the time of Elizabeth. And he was a very wealthy man, and he had a big house. You can see a picture of it here, Gresham House as it was then. The site of this is now where the NatWest Tower stands in London. If you ever go to London, you'll see that. It was our first really big skyscraper. Anyway, Gresham College was set up at the time of James I, and it was intended to be a free school for the people of London, that they could come along, people could come along and listen to lectures for free on all sorts of subjects to do with the liberal arts. And because Sir Thomas Gresham recognised that if England was to become a major force in the world, that the population needed better education. Particularly the merchants did, and the sailors. They needed to know more. So he gave the money and he gave his house for this college to be set up. Well, it didn't work out quite that way because the people in London weren't so keen to spend their evenings or weekends studying geometry or the liberal arts. They preferred to go to the theatre or bear baiting. But what it did do was provide sinecures or professorships for certain scholars who were to be the teachers. And that continued. And in the 1640s, the Invisible College, made up partly of these scholars and partly of some professors from Oxford and Cambridge, started meeting. And here we have some of the founder members of that college, people like Sir Christopher Wren, that you've probably heard of as the architect of St. Paul's Cathedral and many other buildings in London and elsewhere. But he was actually considered a genius mathematician and an astronomer. And he'd been designing sundials using astronomical and mathematical techniques at the age of 14 and wrote a book about it. And then we had Robert Boyle. You probably studied Boyle's law if you did any physics at school about pressure of gases and volumes, the relationship between the volume and the pressure and the temperature. But he was also into a lot more than that. And he was also an alchemist and did a lot to do with chemistry. So he was one of the major thinkers of his day. And then we had Robert Hooke, who later in the Royal Society, I'll come to that in a minute, was their chief experimenter. He was very much an experimental scientist and laid down a lot of the basic rules about the need to carry out experiments to prove what you claim, scientifically speaking, and that it must be testable by someone else doing the same experiment over again. And he's also has his name living on in Hooke's law. And then we had Dr. Seth Ward, who was, I think he was a professor of astronomy at Oxford. A churchman, very great mathematician, very much well thought of in his day. And also John Wallis, who was another professor from Oxford. I think he was the mathematics one, held the same chair, I believe, as Stephen Hawking recently. And then John Evelyn, who's famous for his diary, as a close friend of Charles II, And the Invisible College wasn't concerned about politics. They had a rule that you leave politics and religion at the door. When you're in the college and meeting among the members, you're discussing matters of philosophy and science. So they didn't get into debates on those other subjects. So that formed as a sort of informal college where they would just get together when they could. They sent letters to each other. They wrote to colleagues in Europe. They didn't actually have a building of their own. They met either in Gresham College in London or later on in rooms in Oxford. But it was intended to be a sort of movable college, rather as the earlier symbolic representation of the Rosicrucian College was. This idea of this college on wheels, that it goes around, you see it here, you see it there, but it's receiving its inspiration and it's spreading out the word to do with science and the creation of new civilization, finding, remembering old knowledge that's been forgotten, finding new knowledge, incorporating the two to give a better understanding of the world we live in. Well, the Invisible College actually became the Royal Society once Charles II was restored to his throne in 1660. And it continued in the same vein initially as the Invisible College had, which is researching science, but also having regard to the Bible and to religion as taught and understood in those days. And you have people like Sir Isaac Newton, for example, who, our greatest scientist. We would not have the civilization we have today without Sir Francis Newton. I think everyone would agree with that. But what people don't realize is he wasn't only a scientist. He was also researching the Bible, things like the Book of Revelation. He wrote a lot about it. He tried to work out the day that Jesus is coming back. He was also a practicing alchemist. These things were kind of kept away from the public until fairly recently. I think it's only about the 1970s that his papers were published. And people began to understand that this was a much more complex man than we had been given to understand before that. So, unfortunately, the Royal Society moved away from these ideals. It became more and more a reward, really, for discovering, I don't know, the speed of light or something, and you'd be made a fellow of the Royal Society. But a lot of other areas became taboo that couldn't be discussed. And one that I've been involved with a little bit is the whole concept of electricity in the universe. There's a whole school of thought about people researching and investigating the role of the electric force in the cosmos as it relates to the formation of stars, of galaxies, the northern lights, what powers the sun. These are things you don't hear discussed at all in the mainstream media or in the press. It's a taboo subject as far as mainstream science is concerned. But these are the kind of things that would have been discussed by people in the Invisible College and the Royal Society in its early days. And we will certainly be discussing in our new Invisible College. So we have this new college forming, and I hope you will have a look on our website at www.invcol.com. That's invcol.com, nice and short. I'm going to be posting videos there. There'll be opportunities for membership at different levels. We also have a Facebook page, which you can find and investigate on that. And there will be short videos placed on that. And we'll take it from there. We don't know exactly where this is going to go. It's a new venture. I did, as I say, start this up before in embryonic form, more as an experiment than anything, originally in 2008. At that time, I was doing it with a small company called EMTV, and we were broadcasting some lectures on the Sky platform. Unfortunately, EMTV didn't last, and for various other reasons, particularly to do with health, I had to step back from that for a time. But we're back in business now, and I'm looking forward to the relaunch, and I hope you'll come along and take a look. And if you're interested in ancient wisdom, in new discoveries, in pushing the envelope and helping our rebirth of our civilization, then I hope you'll come along and join us. Thank you.